So as we all know, last week we marked the 55th anniversary of the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. And every year, NAN holds this conference in April to honor Dr. King's legacy. So I'll tell you, I have been reflecting recently that among Dr. King's many gifts was his ability to understand the present moment in the context of a vision for a better future. So Nan, in that spirit then, let us clearly understand the moment we are in. A moment in which our hard-won freedoms are under attack. Because just look at where we are. Extremists across our country attack the freedom to vote. They ban books to attempt to erase America's full history. They attack the ability of people to love openly with pride. They attack the freedom of a woman to make decisions about her own body instead of the government. They attack medication that for 20 years the FDA ruled as being safe. And just yesterday in Florida, extremists there signed a 6-week ban before most women even know they're pregnant. And then, isn't it interesting that in the midst of all these attacks on fundamental freedoms, these so-called leaders dare to tell us they are fighting for our freedoms? Don't you find that interesting? Some have gone so far as to name and brand their agenda the, quote, Freedom Blueprint. Don't fall for the okie doke. Don't fall for the okie doke. Because as we know, freedom, well, it doesn't censor books. Freedom does not criminalize doctors and punish women. Freedom does not turn off a microphone when an elected leader is speaking. And you see, as Dr. King made clear, freedom includes the ability of all people to fully exercise their rights. Rights that generations of Americans bled and died for. Rights that the people in this very room continue to march and fight for. That is our nation's freedom blueprint. And that is what we stand for. And I do believe that when you know what you stand for, you know what to fight for. And so, Nan, two of the many important fights before us, I could go on all day if we were to articulate all of them, but two of them I'm going to talk about this afternoon. One, the fight for our children and all people to be free from gun violence. And two, the fight for freedom to fully participate in a democracy. Both fights fully on display these last few weeks. So just think, in our country, already in the 104 days of this year, there have been more than 150 mass shootings. Already this year. Just think, you've seen the statistics? Gun violence is now the #1 cause for death of children in our nation. And a heartbreaking 1 in 5 Americans has lost a family member to gun violence. And, while all this violence impacts all communities in devastating ways, we know it does not do so equally. Black people are only 13% of America's population, but more than 60% of homicide victims from gun violence. Meanwhile, as Rev said, we speak here while the NRA is holding its convention in Indiana. Now, you know what they've called it? They have called it a, quote, freedom-filled weekend. So we must ask, freedom-filled for who exactly? Because it's not for the parents who pray that their children will come home from school safe, from a classroom in Uvalde or Nashville. Not for those who pray that their loved ones will come home safe from a bank in Louisville, Kentucky, from a grocery store in Buffalo, or from everyday gun violence in communities across our nation. Let us all declare enough is enough. Enough is enough. And here's the thing, the solutions, because there's clearly a problem, the solutions are clear. We must have reasonable gun safety laws at the state and the federal level. And by the way, most gun owners agree. Even the majority of NRA members support background checks for all gun purchases. So let's reject the false choice that some are pushing to suggest that you're either in favor of upholding the Second Amendment or you're in favor of passing reasonable gun safety laws. Let us reject that false choice. We're not falling for the okey doke. And let us continue to demand that leaders step up and show some courage in state houses and in the United States Congress to make background checks universal, repeal the liability shield that protects gun manufacturers, and to renew the assault weapons ban. And I see there are a lot of cameras here, so I'll say this. For everyone watching, please be clear. The voices of students, parents, teachers, and preachers will not be silenced, and these voices must be heard. These voices must be heard. They will not be discouraged or deterred, even if using a bullhorn becomes necessary. These voices will not be silenced. So it's an issue of public safety. And we also know here at NAN and all over our country, I do believe, that the right to public safety is not only about the freedom to learn in a classroom without fear of an active shooter, but it is also freedom to drive to one's mother's house without being killed by 5 lawless officers in a, quote, Scorpions unit. Rev, you and I were in Memphis together when you eulogized Tyree Nichols. And I will say today what I said that day. When we talk about public safety, was not Tyree a member of the public? Was not Tyree also entitled to the right to be safe? And so then, in the name of public safety, can't we all agree that when there is biased policing and excessive force, that it must be met with accountability? Can't we all agree that there is much we must do to increase public safety, and that includes the need for Congress to pass comprehensive police reform legislation? The kind of common sense reform that, by the way, many police officers themselves, including the Major Cities Chiefs Association, have called for. So, we're talking about members of Congress. We're talking about state house legislatures. There's a theme here. They're all elected by the people. By the people. And then change comes in many ways. And one of the most direct is through the ballot box. Because in 2020, let's reflect in 2020. And I'm looking with thanks at the leaders in this room. In 2020, because people stood in line for hours and voted, Joe Biden and I went to the White House. And in 2022, because people voted, women's reproductive freedom in every state ballot from Kentucky to California was protected. We won races for Secretary of State, Attorney General, and Governor. We flipped legislative chambers in 3 states and expanded our majority in the United States Senate. So I say, when we vote, we win. We win. And of course, then, for our right to vote to have meaning, the people we elect, the people who reflect our values and represent our voices, well, they too must be heard. That too is what democracy is about. However, that too has come under attack. And that was what Nashville was all about. An attempt to silence the voices of the people. Now, can you imagine? The voice of the people was too much for these extremists to handle. It was just too much. They couldn't bear it. But you see, the Tennessee Three clearly were not deterred. But those extremists couldn't handle it, so much so that they turned off the microphones. But the Tennessee Three said, all right, let's pull out that bullhorn, because we will be heard. And they channeled the cries and the pleas and the demands of the people, and required that those voices be heard. And then what happened? For only the 4th time in nearly 160 years, there was a vote there in Tennessee to expel elected legislators from their seats. 2 young black men. But 7,000 students and parents continued to march and organize and raise their voices. And now Justin Jones and Justin Pearson are back in their seats. That's right. The people spoke. The people spoke. And that, however, was just the most recent attack that we have seen in an attempt to silence the voice of the people, which, by the way, let's all be clear and we know, is an attack on democracy itself. And just go back 2 years to see the pattern. We can go farther back than that, but let's just go back 2 years. In 2020, NAN helped turn out record numbers of voters during the height of a pandemic. A vote that you anticipated and did result in, for example, an historic $5.8 billion invested in our HBCUs. A vote that resulted in the first black woman to serve on the United States Supreme Court. Her name is Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. Resulted in a cap on insulin at $35 a month for our seniors. A vote that resulted in the lowest rate of black unemployment in the history of the United States of America. Well, the promise, the very promise of that progress from that vote scared a whole lot of people. And so what did they do almost immediately after the 2020 election? In states around our country, extremist so-called leaders started to ban drop boxes, reject mail-in ballots, and even make it a crime to give food and water to people standing in line to vote. Proposed and passed undemocratic laws, un-American laws. But in a democracy, there are still checks and balances. And so to respond to these threats to democracy, because you voted in 2020 and we now have a Department of Justice that actually believes in the pursuit of justice, we were able to double the size of the Department of Justice's team on voting rights enforcement. Checks and balances. Checks and balances also require that Congress do its job and pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. So while we are clear-eyed and see the moment we are in, and in particular, the attacks on our democracy and our foundational principles and values, while we fight off these attacks, I will also say, Nan, we must also keep our eye on the affirmative agenda. We've got to do both. Because remember, Dr. King, when he was assassinated, was on the verge of the next phase in the rights that he was fighting for all Americans that are about civil rights. And he was combining that fight for civil rights and justice with the fight for economic justice. And as Dr. King said in Memphis, we must continue the fight for economic justice as part of our fight for civil rights. And economic justice, then, we know, is our collective commitment to equity and to make sure all people have access to opportunity. It is the fight for paid leave and affordable child care, to permanently expand the child tax credit, to cancel student loan debt, to provide access to capital for small business owners and entrepreneurs, to make sure all families can buy a home, and to protect Social Security and Medicare from attack. We got to keep our eye on our affirmative agenda while we are handling all those attacks. Because we will not fully, I believe, achieve the dream of freedom until it includes economic justice for all, a justice that protects the dignity of work and the basic rights of all people. So in conclusion, Nan, there's a lot I could say, but I'm just going to go with this. I think there is one bottom line that is for sure. We all love our country. We do. We love our country. That's why we fight so hard. We love our country. And we stand in the long tradition of those who have faithfully believed in the founding principles of our nation. But at this moment, the founding principles are under attack. And I believe always, and especially today, that the strength of our nation depends on us each to fulfill our duty, yes, I said our duty, to stand and protect our democracy. And so specifically then, I will speak to the young leaders who are here. And Rev, you are always lifting up our young leaders. Remember, to the young leaders I say, remember, Reverend Sharpton was only 16 when he founded his first organization, the National Youth Movement. 16. Diane Nash was just 21 years old when she led the Nashville sit-ins. John Lewis was only 23 when he spoke during the March on Washington. And it is no coincidence that the two expelled members of the Tennessee Three are both in their 20s. So to our young leaders, I say, we hear you, we support you, and we need you. We need you. We are all in this together, and we need you.